So today's program is entitled The Daode Jing's Forgotten Forebear, the Ancestral Cult, and our speaker is Dr. Kenneth Brashier.
Dr. Brashier comes to us with really great credentials. He was a Rhodes Scholar, and he received his attended Oxford, where he received his bachelor's, and then subsequently he attended Harvard University, where he received his master degree. And then finally, he received his PhD from Cambridge University in England. And his interest has always been in Chinese art and Chinese religion. And more recently, from 1998 until his retirement in this last year in 2021, he was the Thomas Lamb Eliot Professor of Religion and Humanities at Reed College. And he's authored, a number of books. One is, the Ancestral Memory in Early China and the Public Memory in Early China. And very importantly, he's quite, he kind of, let me just mention that, again, then one of his achievements was in 2006, when he was recognized as the National Outstanding Baccalaureate Colleges Professor of the Year. Really a great achievement, and this was sponsored by the Case Carnegie Foundation. And so anyways, with that, I'd like to introduce Kenneth Brashier as our speaker today. Kenneth, let me turn the podium over to you.
I want to thank you, Dennis. It's great to be back with you all today to tell you about my latest project. This time, it's not about late imperial hell scrolls or early Chinese mirrors or medieval poems about the cosmos. Today, you might say you're getting a bit of a twofer. You're actually going to get two of my favorite topics, the ancestral cults and the Tao. Now, having written a couple books, as Dennis just mentioned, on the ancestral cult, you'd think I'd actually be really interested in my own ancestors. But to be honest, that's never actually been the case. What you're looking at right now are rather faded pictures of my own great-great-grandparents. And I only came across these images last summer when I inherited the family photo albums. Nobody else in the family actually wanted them. So I went back to my mother's home in South Dakota to fetch them. And this is as far back as the pictures actually go. Everything else beyond my great-great-grandparents has faded to oblivion. And in fact, as you can see from the pictures here, you can see we're not doing too well here either when it comes to any clear detail. Now, there's a lot more known about the next generation, both in terms about their lives and in terms of detailed images, in part because cameras and studio photography were becoming much more common. This is actually Mary High, my great-grandmother. And while I have to admit, I'm useless when people say, oh, I can see a family resemblance in something. But in this case, maybe I can, because I confess when I look at these computer enhancements of these early images, I can indeed see my own mother's face here. Now, today we're going to talk a lot about ancestors this morning, including how they fade away into oblivion. But it's not just people who have ancestors. Ideas have ancestors too. They don't arise ex nihilo, and that just means that they don't pop out of nowhere, like Athena popping out of the head of Zeus, fully armored. That's a common expression when something just seems to appear on the scene without any history, without any development. You see the picture that I've got here on the left. This is a Grecian urn where Athena is all of a sudden, bang, just there, just coming out of his head with no background, no premise, nothing like this. But ideas are not like that. They do come from somewhere. And I love this observation that you have here from the Liu Chunqiu in the 3rd century BCE. Somebody gazing eastward westward will not see the western wall, and somebody looking off to the south will not notice the north. Ideas depend on location. And when it comes to the Daode Jing and its ideas about the Tao, that location, I'm going to argue this morning, is the ancestral shrine. Now, here's something that's totally bizarre. The Daode Jing is indisputably important, as Dennis was alluding to a moment ago. In fact, the Daode Jing is the most translated book in all of Chinese history. And it's I think in the top 5 in world history as far as number of times it's actually been translated. And as you know, it's also the locus classicus for the Tao in both academic and popular discourses. Even so, I have yet to find a single study or translation that tackles where these ideas came from in the first place. You get the feeling that the Daode Jing just popped into existence. So I'm going to say something pretty radical this morning. I'm going to argue that the basic tenets of the Daode Jing, also known as the Lao Tzu, arose out of the ancestral cult in early China that had preceded it. And so my simple thesis is the ancestral cult is the Daode Jing's forgotten forebear. And this morning, let me give you first some basics about the ancestral cult. Now, I know a lot of you are very familiar with the ancestral cult already, maybe more familiar than I am, but I don't want to assume knowledge for anyone. So I'm going to keep us all on the same page by actually just giving you some basics on the ancestral cult. In part 2, I'm then going to give you some basics about the Daode Jing. And I can make the same caveat here. I know a lot of you have read and are very familiar with Lao Tzu or the Daode Jing and have very strong opinions on what the Tao actually is. But again, I'm not going to assume anything, and we're just going to start on a very basic level. And when I'm actually talking about both the ancestral cult and the Daode Jing, I'm unashamedly going to make the argument parallel with one another, making it very tidy over the course of this presentation, maybe a little bit too tidy, I don't know. But even if we can find these parallels, correlation is not causation, which is why in my third part, I'm going to give you a half dozen cases in which the Daode Jing itself still uses ancestral cult language. To me, this is the most important part, because these are kind of like the damning fingerprints of the ancestors, which are still on the Daode Jing itself. Sometimes those allusions to the ancestral cult, they're very overt. Other times you have to know what to look for. You might not recognize them right away. And let's start on the murky periphery, the undefined darkness at the edge of existence, where everything is merged with everything else. Everything is uncontextualized and chaotic. And poetry from the 2nd century BCE onward frequently describes the visitor to this periphery as being lost in a world of shifting vapors and strange beasts and winged immortals, ending with heaven and earth losing their definition and the visitor losing their senses. As I have here, I gaze into the now black, now white, but there is no seeing. I listen to the agitated delirium, but there is no hearing. This and the next 3 similar sources are parts of longer descriptions about the loss of visual and audio objects, as well as heaven and earth. But I'm actually going to skip the rest of them here just to save time. And by the way, in my slides today, you're going to see a lot of blurred out passages. I simply don't want you to think that I'm latching onto exceptional cases, that there is actually supporting evidence for pretty much everything I'm going to say. If you want, we can always go back and take a look at some of the other evidence later on if you want. And so it's this chaotic, unfixed, blurry periphery into which the dead dissipate. For example, Cai Yong described the whirling and drifting existence of a recently deceased Lady Ma. The chi of her ethereal essence whirls and drifts. Where can we settle her spirit? On whom can her sons now depend? To whom can her daughters draw near? So in other words, now that she's dead, she's unanchored. She's unmoored from that relationship net that had defined her in life. Oh, and by the way, I just want to insert here, I'm not going to talk about the decorations that I put in my slides too much, but this is a good example of what I'm going to be saying in terms of text also happens in terms of art. You see here on the left here, this is an ancestor actually emerging from the chi vapors, from that periphery, that chaotic periphery that I was just talking about, at least according to the archaeologist reports that originally found this tomb. And this is the case, I'm actually going to show you the fuller mural. You can see the ancestor there in the middle. On the right, you see some of the descendants making sacrifices and meeting that ancestor who's emerging from the chi, emerging from the chaos. And down below, you see people actually making sacrifices. But what's kind of neat here, if you look at the lower right of this image, you see this is a model of the actual tomb itself, sort of a cross section. And what's important here is you see that platform, the brick platform that is kind of raised up off the ground there. That's where the coffin would have gone. And so now you have to imagine that mural relative to the coffin. And you can see that, that this is actually the ancestor coming forward from the coffin space. And the sacrificers are actually where the sacrifices literally would be standing. So in other words, this whole two-dimensional image becomes 3 dimensions. But anyway, as I say, I'm not going to go into the art aspect of it quite so much. And instead, I'm going to stick to text because Tsai Yong's textual description isn't unique, as demonstrated by a father's lament for his own dead son. During his life, he never knew his father. Now that he is dead, will he understand who I am? His solitary ethereal essence travels the far reaches of night, whirling and drifting. On whom can he now depend? So you're getting the same language here. In early China, we don't become angels or enjoy eternal life. Instead, in space, the edges are darkened and blurred. In time, the increasingly forgotten dead are left whirling and drifting. And that being the case, it's then up to us as living descendants to fight back with fixity and formalism as long as we can. These 4 passages are all along the same line, but let me again just read out one of them. And this is from the Confucian scholar Yang Xiong. The ghosts and spirits exist in a disarrayed wilderness, and they cannot be imagined in terms of locality or season. In other words, in terms of space or time, meaning that sacrifices to them lacked clear standards. Thus, the sages reified the ghosts and spirits via the sacrificial guidelines. So what Yang Xiong is here saying is the sages streamlined the rituals that reify the unframed spirits. That is, it made them real, made them tangible, bringing them into focus and giving them definition by using rituals. And other texts, as I've got here, are actually using exactly the same language, reifying the ancestors, actually giving them a body, giving them an oomph, a reality. But despite our best efforts to give shape to the shapeless, forms fade as memories fade, and as the rememberers themselves join the ancestors. Despite the tidiness of rituals, structured amnesia, they all are gradually doomed to whirl and drift in that disarrayed wilderness, dissolving into the darkness. So what I want to do right now is I want to follow that fade, beginning with the rememberers themselves who were tidily assembled in ranked order before their ancestral tablets. Then let's work our way back up the line of successive ancestors. First, those who were still individually remembered, and second, those who had faded into the lineage's corporate memory. And then finally, we're going to meet the lineage progenitor. That means the first ancestor. And that first ancestor is often paired with formless heaven. And let's start with the living sacrifices, or as an Eastern Han almanac here portrays these orderly rememberers as follows. When the day of the sacrifice arrives, they bring forward the ale to draw down the spirits. When that is done, the worthy and humble of the household, no matter how young or old, then sit before the ancestors in ranked order. The sons, their wives, the grandsons, the great-grandsons, each offer up spiced ale to the family head, toasting him with wishes of longevity in a joyous manner. Now, other texts go on to detail how the living were arranged by generation and by family rank, both to honor the dead and to venerate seniority among the living. And so the emphasis is order, the living all clearly arranged relative to one another in their individual spaces. Everything's in its box. And that desire for order extended to the space of the shrine as well. The first passage here happens to be one of the most famous poems from the most famous of the Confucian classics, the Book of Songs, or the classic of poetry, the Shi Jing. Oh, the stately, immaculate shrine. Its distinguished attendants are respectful and harmonized. The many solemn officials uphold the potency, of King One, lest it dissipate into the heavens. By the way, keep an eye out for this term or potency, because it's going to be coming up a lot today, both in terms of the ancestral cult descriptions and, of course, in the Daode Jing. It's the same the same character we're talking about. But for now, these passages all advocate order, cleanliness, calmness, lest the ancestor dissipate into the heavens. Order and clear demarcation were the watchwords for the rememberers. And that order and demarcation extended to the sacrifice recipients as well, at least to the most recent ancestors. Before you actually go into the sacrifice, you actually carried out abstentions for several days. That is, you would avoid certain kinds of food. You would not eat strong vegetables. You would not drink. You would not have sex. All kinds of things to start focusing your mind for the ancestral sacrifice to come. But also during this time period, this is what's really interesting, you had to think about your ancestors, and you think about them in a way to really individuate them. In this case, think upon your ancestors' dwelling, think upon their amusing talk, think upon their intentions and ideas, think upon their entertainments, and think upon their desires. Now, this passage goes on, this is from the lineage, or also known as the ritual records. This passage goes on to then say, if you spent all this time during the abstentions actually thinking about your individual ancestors, you're actually going to see that ancestor in the sacrifice itself. Now, as a group, the most recent generations were to be arranged into alternating generations flanking the principal tablet, because that strict ordering is, quote, how the sequence of fathers and sons, close and distant, old and young, near and far relations is demarcated without chaos, unquote. So again, the emphasis is order. And I love this particular image that I'm showing you here. Sorry, I'm going to talk about the art one more time here. This is actually not from early China. This is actually from the Middle Period, from the Song Dynasty, but it is actually an illustration intended to be read with a text from early China. That is the classic of filial piety, the Xiaojing. And this is showing us what an ancestral sacrifice looked like, or at least how they envisioned it in the Song Dynasty. And at the front, you've got the first ancestor, the progenitor tablet. That's the big tablet. On the sides, you've got the flanking tablets of the most recent ancestors. So on the lower left-hand side, you probably have Dad there. He's the most recent ancestor, and it goes back and forth, and then approaching the principal tablet in the back. Oh, and by the way, when I show this to my students, or when I had students, I'm now retired, they always ask me, what about that little tablet behind the woman there? That's probably the wife. Wives were their tablets were actually placed alongside that of their husbands, but also notice there's only one tablet for a wife. Wives were actually, they faded from the memory very quickly relative to their husbands. Now, anyway, how many generations are we supposed to remember? Well, we actually have 10 different sources from early China that try to work through a model of how many we remember. And it varies from, usually says for the imperial family, they can remember 4 generations. For the commoners, they get maybe 1 generation, just 1 tablet, or not even that. Although they then say that that's because the commoners don't actually have a dedicated altar, that they don't have a permanent altar set up for their ancestors, but they still remember 1 generation prior to that, because all of that is supposed to be ritual protocol. Okay, so what happens to the ancestors who have then faded from memory, that have actually gone beyond these immediate tablets? Well, ritually speaking, they merged with the lineage's corporate identity. This is Chancellor Quang Hung in the 1st century BCE, and he's drawing on lots of ritual compendia that he has at his disposal. And this is how he summarizes it. He says, the ruler who had first received the mandate is personally connected to heaven. And so for 10,000 generations, his shrine is not decommissioned. As for all those who later continue the imperial undertaking, they are promoted through the 5-shrine system. At the top, that is, when they reach 5 generations back, they are arrayed alongside the grand ancestor, only partaking in triennial sacrifices, one sacrifice every 3 years. This general principle resonates with heaven. So, ancestors, after a few generations, don't get their own altars anymore, and they have to join the lineage founder at the top of this 5-shrine system that he's describing. So they're no longer individually remembered, and these faded ancestors then got fewer sacrifices. And other sources even say that these older ancestors were all clustered together in a communal vault of their own. But you know, that's okay, actually, because according to court advisor Liu Xin that I've got at the bottom here, he explained that the more distant means the more revered, so that the triennial sacrifice becomes the most significant. When I'm trying to explain this to my students, I tell them, you know, imagine Christmas. What if Christmas were every day? Well, it wouldn't be so special then. Part of Christmas's specialness is because it is rare, because it only happens once a year. And that's what Liu Xin is arguing for the ancient ancestors. Sure, they're not getting all the sacrifices that the immediate ancestors are getting, but they're all the more special because they are fewer sacrifices. So here and in other texts, the ancestors are promoted through this system. And that language in these early texts is very appropriate because ancestors faded, but they faded upward. A father's father is always more important than a father. And of course, a father is more important than a son when we're talking about filial piety and age veneration. As we saw, while the more distant ancestors only receive sacrifices every few years, that rarity, in fact, made those sacrifices all the more special. So generally speaking, distance was directly proportional to respect. And when Confucius himself said he respected the ghosts and spirits and distanced them, that's a quote from the Analects, he was indeed honoring them by distancing them, which is a sentiment you find repeated in many other early texts as well. And this is another example, by the way, of having knowledge about the ancestral cult makes you reread these early texts differently. You see this phrase about Confucius respecting the spirits but keeping them at a distance. All the modern commentaries, they all say that, oh, that's because he's more interested in worldly affairs and he's not worried about ghosts and spirits and things like that. Actually, that's a misreading of the text because at that time, the ancestral cult equated respect and distance. The two actually went hand in hand with one another. And that's why it's really important for us to know the context of the text that we're actually reading today, not just in terms of the Daode Jing, but also in terms of the Confucian text we're reading. So in summary, the highest ancestors were not only more remote, but they were also more revered for being so. And by analogy, the emperor differed from the lower bureaucrats because he himself lived in a faraway capital, hidden behind high walls, and his invisibility made him all the more spiritually potent. And that's not just my supposition, that's the early texts actually say that, because you can't see the emperor, you increase his shun, his spirituality. But at the very top of this line of ascent, and you can see my doodle here, you see that we've got the lineage progenitor. In this case, it's for an imperial lineage. He is the first recipient of heaven's mandate. He held the clan together, and he was in turn partnered, with the inhuman forces of heaven. He's kind of like a transistor, a node between human needs and these cosmic nebulous forces. You know, instead of praying to heaven, you actually pray to your ancestor who then negotiates with heaven. So they're kind of the intermediaries in between. By the way, we not only fade upward, losing our distinctiveness, our lineage also becomes increasingly united as one. That is, we basically got an inverted family tree, the many branch lineages coalescing into fewer principal branches, fewer principal limbs, then finally joining the trunk and then hitting that that progenitor, the root, or everything's inverted here. But in this case, the progenitor, that first ancestor, is actually paired with heaven itself. And as I just said, that first ancestor is this counterpart. In fact, pei literally means to be married to, or as one early text typically describes it, in general, sacrificing to heaven in the southern suburbs as counterpart to the first ancestor is how the ruler taught the people to recompense de and not forget their origins. There's that term de again. We will get back to that. Well, I'll try to actually describe what that is in a moment. So what I want to do now is I simply want to summarize the first part of my thesis. If we schematically imagine the basic ancestral cult as evidenced in these numerous texts. First, the living descendants down below displayed order and gradation when they engaged in ritual remembrance of their ancestors. Second, the immediate ancestors who could still be remembered remained individuated in their enjoyment of the sacrifices, but the more distant ancestors who had faded from memory merged into the corporate body led by a single lineage progenitor. Finally, that lineage progenitor, that first ancestor who was the highest power in the human lineage and who possessed all of this he served as the counterpart to the forces of formless heaven. So from numerous individuated, well-organized descendants below to formless heaven above, this ritual structure digitized the process of fading memory, superimposing a map onto this disarrayed wilderness that Yang Qiang was describing earlier. Okay, now, Ken, I get to take a breath. This is actually the end of the first part that I wanted to make for this argument. So much for the ancestral cult itself, because now what I want to do is I want to make a very abrupt shift to the second part of my thesis, to a different kind of cosmic map. Although it's not actually as different as it might appear on the surface. It also starts close to home with clear definitions and individuated things, but then proceeds to something utterly intangible. You see, when we're talking about the Daode Jing, I think the backbone of the Laozi or the Daode Jing is how every A generates its own implicit not A. The A and not A intrinsically, necessarily, and entirely bound together. And when A and not A are entirely merged without distinction, that's what we call the Tao. But in conventional reality, our naming or our conceiving of anything, I should put thing in scare quotes here, is an implicit combination of that thing plus its not thing, even though we tend to forget the not thing as we distance ourselves from the Tao. Okay, that sounds probably kind of confusing, but I'm going to explain this with some very simple examples. And these examples all come from the Daode Jing itself. First, implicit oppositional negative frames. In other words, the idea of beauty implicitly generates the idea of ugly. Good generates bad, difficult generates easy, long generates short, high generates low, before generates after, and so on and so forth. You can't have one without the other. You can't have an idea of goodness unless you also have an idea of badness. And again, I remind you, these are actually straight from the Daode Jing. This is actually from the second chapter of the Daode Jing. Second, the implicit spatial negative frame. And here I'm thinking about chapter 11 of the Daode Jing. A wheel only works if there is a knot wheel, in other words, a hub where the axle will fit at the center of it. And this is the famous passage where 30 spokes make a wheel, but they all converge on emptiness in the middle. And that emptiness in the middle is referring to the fact that it has a hub, it has a space, a nothingness, a knot wheel in the middle, so that wheel can actually function. Imagine, if it were completely solid, there's no place for an axle and it just simply wouldn't work. Or a cup. This cup only works because there is a knot cup in the middle of that cup. So it's the knot cup which actually gives the functionality to the cup itself. Or I'm talking to you from a lovely room here. This is actually my shed in my backyard. And these are real books here. That's not actually a Zoom backdrop. Wonderful walls, but these walls, this room would not work unless there were a not room, i.e. a door, that would actually allow me to enter and exit the room. And so in other words, in spatial terms, we need that not thing to actually make the thing useful. And if we're talking about space, we also must talk about time, of course, the implicit temporal negative frame. The idea of gathering inward can only be defined by first extending outward. The idea of weakening can only be defined by first strengthening. The idea of rejecting can only be defined by first elevating, and so forth. Finally, we've got the implicit categorical negative frame. Blue is defined by not red, not yellow, not white, not black. Sweet is defined by not salty, not sour, not bitter, not pungent, and so forth. Now, again, these are not my own examples. These are all lists of examples you can find in the Daode Jing itself. And the simple fact that this text discretely clusters particular types of A not A examples implies to me that the Daode Jing authors recognize these several different kinds of dualisms. There may be other kinds of dualisms in there, but these happen to be the four that I've noticed. The Tao itself, simply put, is the necessary unity that must exist for A and not A to mutually define one another. A and not A must unite in a shared category. Let's call that category the Tao. And if they weren't in the shared category, neither could properly exist independent of the other. That is, if A is elevated by itself, and if we forgot all about the not A, that's when the category breaks. That's when the Tao falls. The Tao is a unity and mergence. It is what necessarily connects beauty and ugly into a common category, removing their apparent separateness via a mutual definition. Basically, the Tao is glue. But this ultimate unity of the Tao can't itself be thinged. It can't be considered an A. When I'm talking to my students, I give them all these examples of how beauty is defined by ugly and all these various dualisms, and then and when I think they've actually got it, I then look off into the distance out the window and say, "Oh my goodness, look, the Tao!" And then, I don't know, half my students usually look out the window and say, "He's crazy, what's going on?" The other half actually latch onto this idea of dualisms. Oh, if I actually have the idea of Tao, that can only exist via the idea of not Tao. And that's impossible. And so this is why the Tao can't be spoken. But we're going to go there in a moment. We'll talk about that at the very end of my talk today. But for now, let's just remember that the Tao is empty, formless, unfixed, indistinct, blurry, obscure, dark, bland, and nameless. And these are the Daode Jing's own adjectives for the Tao. So in summary, the closer anything gets to the Tao state itself, the closer that thing gets to its not that thing, heading off toward a kind of mergence. Or summarizing how the Tao was epitomized in antiquity, chapter 65 ends, when the darkened de becomes deep and distant, and when it becomes opposed to being thinged, only then do we reach great conformity. And note the de we saw in the Ancestral Cult is back. And again, it's the closest thing we have to the formless, indistinct blur. But again, I'm going to push that back. We're not going to fully analyze the de just yet. But at this point, I think a sample passage will really help us understand what's going on in the Daode Jing. And this is the famous chapter 18. I'll just read it out here. If the great Tao is set aside, then there are benevolence and proper relationships. If wisdom and intelligence emerge, then there is great artifice. If the relationships between father and son, elder and younger brother, as well as husband and wife, lose their harmony, then there are filial piety and affection. If the ruling houses fall into confusion and chaos, then there are loyal officials. Now, most of the Daode Jing interpreters today praise this passage as an argument against Confucianism, the watchwords of which were indeed benevolence and proper relationships. And these modern interpreters maintain that Confucianism and its so-called benevolence must be hypocritical, artificial, false, classicist, unnatural, confusing, and annoying. And these are not my words. These are their words, actually, when they're describing how they think the Daode Jing is seeing Confucianism. Their assumption is because benevolence happened when the Tao fell, we have to figure out a way of making benevolence look bad. But this approach doesn't work, even within the confines of the Daode Jing itself. First, the Daode Jing elsewhere has nice things to say about benevolence. Second, this same approach applied elsewhere in the Daode Jing clearly runs into some problems. Let me give you an example. This is Daode Jing 38, which starts out very similar. It says, when the Tao was lost, there was the Da. When the Da was lost, there was benevolence. When benevolence was lost, there were proper relationships. When proper relationships were lost, there was ritual. Now, if those Daode Jing interpreters were correct, then here in chapter 38, the Da must also be hypocritical, artificial, and false. But that's clearly contrary to a book entitled The Daode Jing. The Da is considered one of the greatest ideas out there. No, something else has to be going on here. The Daode Jing does not trash talk the Da. But if we instead think about this in terms of A not A, in terms of these implicit negative frames, and we apply it to chapter 18, then when benevolence arose, not benevolence also arose in tandem. And so the Tao's homogeneous state has indeed become lost. As the chapter then says, we can recognize filial piety only when families are in chaos. We can identify loyal officials only when the states are in disorder. In sum, any quality or thing is only identifiable by the coexistence of its not that quality or not that thing. And such is even true when naming the Tao itself, as the opening lines of the Daode Jing explain, but I'm going to get back to that later on. Here in chapter 18, it's not singling out Confucian benevolence for attack, but it's instead making an argument about all dualisms, loyalty, benevolence, Da, or even the Tao. And again, Tao in scare quotes in this case. So let's go back to our chart for a moment. And you'll recall that in part one, we moved from tidy, orderly descendants down below, up through fading ancestors to the progenitor, and then to formless heaven. Now we can fill in the Daode Jing's argument in a parallel trajectory. First, at the bottom of the spectrum, people live in a day-to-day world of the 10,000 things where each dualistic A is distinct. It's not A usually ignored. I mean, when we talk about benevolence, we usually don't think about how benevolence can only exist alongside not benevolence. Second, the sages pursue the attainment of Da by realizing how A and not A in fact define one another, gradually moving up from, for example, ritual to proper relationships, to benevolence, to the Da, and then to the Tao. And that's just repeating chapter 38 of the Daode Jing. Finally, That Dao up top is a dark homogeneity where definition gets lost, where all the A's and not A's are blurred in unity and mergence. So part 2's threefold schematic is now familiar because it's replicating the basic paradigm of the ancestral cult described in part 1. We get individuated, definable things down below, moving to a unitary and undefinable Dao up above. Now I get to pause one more time because I've actually given you these two, what I think are parallel arguments, although correlation is not causation. This is not the main thrust of the argument yet. This is just showing you how the ancestral cult and the Daode Jing are actually parallel to one another. And you know, when it comes to the ancestors themselves, it's kind of nice to actually rely on things, on actual, you know, concrete objects when we use them to remember them by. Souvenirs, which in French means, you know, to remember. And my own fading ancestors actually had their own souvenirs. For example, when I closely examine those old photos of Mary High, I noticed they shared something in common. And here I literally mean something. In fact, I'm going to give you a second here. I don't know if you can actually spot what's actually, one of these is her wedding photo of my great-grandmother. And the other one, I'm not sure. It's just a studio photograph. I'm not sure what it is. But if you look very closely, you'll see that there's something similar in the two pictures. And if this were interactive at this point, I'd ask you if anybody can actually see it. But I'm assuming actually a lot of you can. It's actually the brooch that is actually at her neck. Now, imagine my surprise when I finally had a chance to travel back to South Dakota last summer and open my late mother's bank deposit box. And I found in a little unlabeled envelope that brooch. I don't know if you can actually, I actually have it with me. It's not going to focus in there. But it's actually the same brooch that she is wearing at her neck. However, that's not the only thing that Mary High had left behind. And this is actually, we do not even have to guess that it was hers because it's labeled as her. This souvenir leaves little doubt that it belonged to her. This is what is called a Clemens bottle. And it's made by arranging individual grains of naturally colored sand into a pattern or picture inside a bottle. Andrew Clemens was famous for actually taking these long fish hooks and this naturally colored sand and grain by grain arranging pictures that you can see inside these bottles. And he made this one in 1883 for my great-grandmother, Mary High. Now, it's nice to have concrete remnants of ancestors, but this morning, of course, we're going to be interested in the concrete remnants of the ancestral cults, in this case, inside the Daode Jing. And in this case, the souvenirs are the ancestral cult language still found within the Daode Jing. That is, we not only have a general resemblance in the underlying arguments of the ancestral cult and of the Daode Jing, in other words, this ladder rising upward from complete profane individuation to complete ultimate homogeneity, we also can suggestively establish argument paternity, if you will, by identifying the ancestral cult language that remains within the Daode Jing. So I'm going to end up and wrap up here with just a quick half dozen examples in which the Daode Jing directly draws upon the ancestral cult. And let's start with the Daode Jing's brief chapter 33, which consists of 4 couplets, the first 3 of which are relatively straightforward. Understanding others constitutes knowledge, but understanding the self constitutes enlightenment. Overcoming others is power, but overcoming the self is vigor. Understanding sufficiency is wealth. Vigorous practice is possessing intent. Now, the first 2 couplets prioritize conquering the self over conquering others, which is wholly appropriate in a text that values wu wei, or not acting upon others. And the 3rd couplet commends that self's sufficiency and hard work. But the problem is the 4th couplet, and the final couplet here. This is the result of that well-focused lifetime. And how we interpret it, this has actually perplexed us ever since the 2nd century CE. And you see, the problem is the words "si" and "wang" both mean the same thing in early Chinese. They mean to die. And so you end up people trying to think, oh, yeah, they give you these vague poetic interpretations like dying without perishing. But, what does that mean? No one's actually sure. Well, fortunately, the Mawangdui versions, which were excavated in the 1970s, removes this confusion because they actually replace Wang with Wang. You can see it's a slightly different character, but it makes total sense now. Hence, the fourth couplet reads, those who do not lose their position endure, those who die but are not forgotten are longevous. So in other words, you can see that, this idea of not forgetting ancestors and that not forgetting is actually prolonging their ancestral existence is actually embedded in the Daode Jing itself. And by the way, I should explain one thing about longevous here. This shou in early Chinese. Unlike English, when we think of longevity, we think about a lifespan, but shou in early Chinese is your total life, which includes your life and your afterlife. Because remember, we fade away over time, but the whole thing together is actually shou. This is your longevity. And in fact, we see the term all the time in ancestral halls and ancestral tombs. They actually have this descriptive term shou in front of them. So in this final line, it clearly resonates with the ancestral cult's basic idea of remembrance equating with postmortem existence. The unforgotten dead survive, at least for a while. Now, I'm aware of the time, and so I'm actually going to skip a couple of my examples here. And I'm going to charge over, I'll move ahead in my script here. There we are. I'm going to charge over to my fourth example and just talk about my last three examples. These are my favorite ones because they're the most direct in actually talking about the ancestral cult itself. And when the Daode Jing directly alludes to ancestral spirits, it's usually talking about the most distant of the ancestors, the always to be remembered lineage progenitor, the first ancestor, who isn't forgotten, who is in fact the best remembered and the most powerful of ancestors because he represents the lineage as a whole. For example, chapter 21 offers a longer allusion to the mechanics of the ancestral cult, equating Da with that progenitor. But before we unpack that, we actually finally better talk about what Da actually is. So what is Da? Well, it's often rendered as potency or power, but Da is simply the Tao when instantiated. The Tao when it is actually instantiated, usually within people themselves. And here the Guanzi, this is written about the same time as the Daode Jing was compiled, actually. It gives us a very nice summary of what the Tao is in relationship to the Tao, Da. The Tao of heaven is empty and without form. Because it is empty, it cannot be bent. Because it is without form, it is unfixed. Being unfixed, it flows everywhere among the 10,000 things and never changes. The Da is our dwelling within the Tao, and those things attain the Da to live. Not acting upon things, Wu Wei, is called the Tao. Dwelling within the Tao is called the Da. Hence, the Tao cannot be separated from the Da, and so we do not separate them when we discuss them. We only separate them in discussion to highlight the fact that the Da is our dwelling within the Tao. So it's simply saying that the Da here is the first instantiation of the Tao. It is the first reification of that formless Tao. And this relationship between formless Tao and instantiated Da is useful when understanding chapter 21, the entirety of which is as follows. When the great Da manifested, it descended from the Tao alone. It was the Tao reified as a thing. Such blurriness, such indistinctness, indistinct and blurry, but with a form therein. Blurry and indistinct, but with a thing therein. Obscured and dark, but with a seed therein, a seed perfectly real and with a point of dependency therein. From antiquity to the present, we have never discarded the name of that one who had first manifested the Da, and it was duly passed down through our ancestors. And how do I know about the success of our ancestors? through itself. Okay, so the first part of this passage describes the appearance of the de within the Tao, from a blur to a form, to a thing, to a seed capable of reproduction, and finally to a point of dependency, that first reference point for the lineage itself. The second part fixes that de in subsequent historical time, the first name established and passed down from father to father through the generations. And I mean this very literally when you're talking about the ancestral cult. Remember those tablets we were looking at? It's got a name on it. That big tablet in the front, it's usually the surname tablet, or it's the name of that first ancestor, that first progenitor. And that's literally what's being handed down through the generations. So the first name is established and passed down from father to father through the generations. The forefathers are in fact connected through that name. And at the end of the passage, when it says through itself, that's referring to the fact that all of this is self-evident by the fact that this lineage exists today. It exists in the present. Significantly, this connection between de and lineage recurs at the beginning of chapter 54 as well. Firmly grounded, the de is never taken away. Firmly embraced, it is never released. And because of it, future generations have never abandoned their sacrifices. Well, there you have it. I mean, there's very overt references to the ancestral cult being made here, and you can see how it is parallel to this understanding of the Tao itself. So these are just a couple of the more obvious ancestral cult references. Now, contemporaneous readers of chapters 21 and 54 would have readily recognized this description as the emergence of a lineage progenitor from heaven, whose name is indeed, as I say, preserved forever in the sacrifices. In the ancestral cult, that first ancestor was frequently and explicitly identified as the original manifestation of de inside that lineage. And this is really important here because this is one of the biggest bits of glue between the Daode Jing and the ancestral cult. It's this idea of de, because first ancestors are always described as having the maximum de of a lineage. And here I'm just giving you one example of this from the Gulian commentary of the Spring and Autumn Annals. Spring and Autumn Annals is one of the Confucian classics. Thus, as for those rich in de, their heritage is brilliant, but as for those poor in de, their heritage is meager. Therefore, the origin of the initial de is honored, and he who is the first to be in fief must be treated as first ancestor. So here, de is specifically associated with that first ancestor, the progenitor. And the same idea is repeated in several other texts, but again, I'm going to skip over those to save time. So in summary, an early reader of the Daode Jing, being familiar with the ancestral cult, would have associated the formless Tao with heaven and the instantiated de with the progenitor emerging from heaven. We see it in all these other texts that are contemporaneous to the Daode Jing. And that de here extends its line of influence down into the present, meriting these perpetual sacrifices. So the de is the first thing. It is the first point of dependence or trust. It is the ancestral progenitor who bears the first name. Now, for my penultimate example, chapter 35 ends with the following images of the indistinct and the blurry. Music and tasty treats may make the passing guest halt, but what comes forth from the Tao's mouth is bland in its tastelessness. If you look for it, you will not be able to see it. If you listen for it, you will not be able to hear it. And if you employ it, you will not be able to use it up. Okay, this language is not explicitly talking about the ancestral cult, but those people at the time probably would have recognized it as such, because we have lots of texts at this time describing the spirits exactly the same way. For example, I've just given you one from the Zhongyong here. This is one of the most famous texts in early China, and it's attributed to the mouth of Confucius himself. The de of the spirits and ghosts, does it not flourish? I may look for them, but will not see them. I may listen for them, but will not hear them. By the way, this sounds like that early poetry we were talking about at the very beginning of my talk today, they are impossible to see. But notice it's talking de yet again. But the reason why I'm including this particular passage here is because according to the French historian Gilles Boileau, this contrast between tasty treats and bland flavors might actually allude to ancestral rituals that distinguished between the offerings earmarked for recent ancestors and for remote ancestors, respectively. That is, those for recent ancestors are in fact complex, distinctive, and sophisticated. Those for the remote ancestors, I really feel sorry for the remote ancestors because their food is boring. It's simple, it's unseasoned, it's one note. And in fact, early texts actually give you the recipe. Take a piece of meat, boil it. That's their food. That's called the great stew. But the point is, it's bland. It has none of the distinctions. There's no A, not A distinctions going on in the bland homogeneity, even when it comes to flavor itself. And Boileau concludes that in the Daode Jing, passages mentioning taste in music could be interpreted as a philosophical metaphorization and modification of ritual elaborations on the value of the great stew, numerous tasty dishes system. And we have a lot of excavated texts that actually back up the fact that this was actually done. They actually had this great stew, this really boring food for the most ancient of the ancestors. Finally, this system of simplicity, unity, boring stew at the top, and then complexity, demarcation, tasty dishes at the bottom reaches its most famous philosophical expression in the opening lines of the Daode Jing. As for the Tao, it is permissible to think of it as a Tao, but that's not the continuous Tao. And as for naming, it is permissible to name, but that's not continuous naming. Now, a lot of people have their opinions on what this actually means. Now, let me explain how I read this using this A not A approach that I've been describing today. The first two lines are looking at the same problem, but from opposite sides. As already observed, the Tao is reaching toward continuous unity, which is a murky, undefined, nameless state. Naming is conversely reaching toward continuous fracturing, where every A is in its separate box. But in any discourse on the Tao, simply regarding the Tao itself as a thing, as a Tao, as I said earlier, well, that's actually not the Tao, because we are now talking about it as a thing, which has to be defined by its not thing. The Tao has to be defined by its not Tao. So in other words, the first chapter of the Daode Jing is actually a caveat. It's basically saying, okay, I'm going to talk about the Tao now, but it's not the true Tao, because anytime I talk about the Tao, I'm making it into a thing. So it's a kind of caveat. On the other hand, we've got this idea of total fracturing. Now, that's just as unreachable as total Taoing, total unity, because as we already observed, every A needs its not A. Beauty needs its ugly. High needs its low, and so forth. And so all the box stays can't simply fly apart in every direction in a bid for absolute deconstruction. There's another text called the Liedza. I love the way it describes it in the sense that, you know, it describes a state in which day flies apart from night, and so each loses what distinguishes it. Where cold flies apart from hot, and so again, each loses what distinguishes it. Well, that's what's happening when you have absolute naming, absolutely everything inside its box. Hence, the Daode Jing begins with a caveat. By its very nature, it's got to work within the spectrum between ultimate unity and ultimate fracturing, between the absolutes of continuous Taoing and continuous naming. Furthermore, this chapter 1 will go on to say that Taoing and naming, in fact, define one another as well. They constitute a giant A not A. That is, continuous unity can only be understood via continuous fracturing and vice versa. And the chapter then concludes that this giant dualism too must ultimately be transcended. Now, this Taoing and naming spectrum helps us better understand the second couplet of the Laozi, of the Daode Jing, in which you're going to notice an unusual word choice where I diverge from the standard translations. Namelessness is the first ancestor of the 10,000 things, whereas names are the mother of the 10,000 things. So namelessness being the first ancestor. Usually this term sure is simply rendered as the beginning of the 10,000 things. And that's viable, but this word sure is actually the standard term we have for the lineage progenitor, for the first ancestor. That's what we call it. We call it the sure. Which, and also the reason why I'm kind of convinced this is how we should be interpreting it is because in Chinese, we love parallel structures all the time. And that first ancestor then becomes parallel to this idea of the mother in the second half of that couplet. So Daoing is contrasted with naming. The distant first ancestor is contrasted with our most intimate ancestor, our mothers. So like the Tao, the first ancestor whose embodiment of Da is most revered, but we ourselves tend to dwell in this more immediate conventional reality of naming, of A's that forget all of the not A's. I take a deep breath now because I've been rather audacious in all of this. I've arrogantly retranslated the famous opening lines of China's most translated book in all of history. My bad. But while the Tao may have emerged out of that darkened, ineffable, and continuous state that knows no dualistic Tao or not Tao, I don't think the Daode Jing itself similarly emerged ex nihilo. I'm arguing that the basic paradigm of discrete, mundane individuation on one end, shifting toward an ultimate ideal of blurry unity on the other, all arose from the already existing habituated ritual practices in the lineage-based culture. And hence we have explicit ancestral cult language retained in the Daode Jing, from fading spirits to potentially forgotten dead to justified sacrifices and these embodying progenitors. You know, it's always too easy to think of philosophies as being unique to themselves. The term we use is sui generis, that, you know, they just hover out there on their own. And the few times that we actually try to link a philosophy to our practical world, we usually think of the philosophy as influencing the practical world. You know, ideas catch on and they trickle down. But I think it can happen the other way as well. Someone had a good idea, but it's an idea that actually is the product of that person's circumstances. And I think this general practice actually came to be crystallized in terms of the Daode Jing. And that's where I come back to the idea that ideas depend on their location. Now, it may have sounded really arrogant of me to pretend to have discovered the Daode Jing's forgotten forebear. But just as ideas are situated, the students of those ideas are also situated. And my own situatedness happens to be as a student of the Ancestral Cult, having for over the years published more than 1,200 pages on ancestral and public memory in early China. So that's my unique situatedness as a researcher that let me see the idea that maybe others had not seen before. That's all. And I always emphasize this to my students. I'm not particularly smart. I'm just particularly situated. And that's a lesson I'd like to leave with all of you too. Take advantage of your own situatedness to see things that others may not have seen before. Oh, and speaking of situatedness, the situatedness of my great-grandmother, Mary High, has itself changed this year. You see, she's moved. She actually has a new home. It only made sense because I have cats that love to knock things off of shelves. And so I donated the Clemens bottle to the Smithsonian and the Smithsonian was very grateful because they didn't actually have a Clemens bottle prior to this. And so she waits for you now in Washington, D.C. for you to come and visit her in her new digs. So I guess not all ancestors completely fade away. Oh, and one very last thing. As some of you may know, the television program Saturday Night Live has a 5-timers club for those who have hosted 5 times. First Saturday, no doubt, has something similar for 5-time speakers. So Dennis, where's my commemorative robe? I'm assuming you're going to bring it over at some point. And while I wait for that robe, I now actually hand it over to some questions, and maybe I can give you some answers. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't go on too long and rattle on about this too much, but it's a topic that I'm quite passionate about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was fabulous. And I feel like I need to go and study everything. Really. We are, as Ken has mentioned, moving into our Q&A period. So if you guys have questions, a reminder, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or it might be at the top. And then you can type in your question. If you can't find that, or you're on a small device, you can also put your question in the chat, and we will do our best to get those answered. I think we've got a couple questions, so we will get started. And then again, feel free to add questions whenever you think of them. All right, our first question came in early in your talk, Ken, and it is who is the Son of Heaven who shows respect to the lineage?
Good question, and I didn't explain it. I should have. You're right. The Son of Heaven is actually another name for the emperor, actually, or prior to Imperial China, which begins in 221 BCE, it would be a term for the king. So it's actually the highest person, and in a way, this is a nice way of thinking about the lineage as well. The Son of Heaven, he's actually a descendant of the heavens themselves. And you saw that doodle that I did where you're moving up the ancestors, you get to that first ancestor who is indeed paired with heaven. But whenever we come across the term Son of Heaven, it's simply referring to the to the emperor himself. And that's usually in contrast with, say, lower officials or with commoners who actually remember shorter periods or shorter numbers, lesser numbers of prior generations. So yeah, it's simply a word for the emperor.
Great, thank you so much. Another question comes in. Was the Daode Jing written by one person?
Very good question. Probably not. Lao Tzu probably is a myth, actually, as far as being an actual person. And we know more and more about this now because of excavations which are going on. Now, prior to the imperial period, as I say, that's in 221 BCE. That's our, the first emperor in the state of Qin. That's kind of the date we often use to balance around. Prior to that, we've excavated versions of the Daode Jing on these bamboo strips, but they are not complete. That is, you may have a collection of 40 or 50 of the chapters, or 81 chapters to the Daode Jing, and so you'd have a selection traveling around on its own. So you need to think of the 81 chapters, they're really, really short, of the Daode Jing as more like independent ideas, a corpus of ideas that's moving around. When I describe it to my students, think of these early texts as kind of like 3-ring binders, and you put in some pages, you take out other pages. It's only when we get to the Western Han Dynasty, the 2nd century BCE, that binder snaps shut and it becomes solidified into pretty much the text that we know it today. And in fact, I mentioned Ma Wangdui a moment ago. There are 2 versions of the Daode Jing written on silk in the Daode Jing, but it actually, and that has 2 nice things. One, it tells us that these 81 chapters, that's when we actually can firmly talk about a set text, although it's rearranged a little bit differently. But also the order of those texts is generally becoming stable. When we have those bamboo strips prior to the imperial age, the first thing that wears out are the strings that ties the bamboo together, and so we don't actually know the order even. So in other words, this is a long answer, but it's fascinating because no, it probably was not one author. It was probably a discourse which was circulating, chapters adding in, chapters being taken out, but it's only by the time we get into about the 2nd century BCE, we can actually talk about a single text.
Thank you so much. That's great. All right, we've got some more questions rolling in. The next one is, you've talked about your studies and where you're situated. And so the question about your theory is it controversial?
We'll find out. Actually, it's not been published yet. It is being published this year in a collected book put out by State University of New York Press. And it will be the first time that I've actually launched this idea onto the world. So we'll see what kind of pushback. You're actually one of the first people to actually hear the argument itself. Those people I've actually given the argument to before, I've not heard any contrary. Everyone's liked it so far, but it's been a limited audience. I've talked to a couple academic forums about it, and the original editors of this book that it's going into, they love it and so forth. But I don't know. We will find out probably this fall or this coming winter whether or not Ken is inspired or Ken is very, very stupid. I'm waging my bet on the latter, actually.
I might say something to the contrary on that. Absolutely. Well, thank you. I feel even more privileged now to have heard your talk and your explanation of your theory now that we know we've had a little preview of it. And we look forward to hearing about that reception, which I'm sure will be stellar.
We'll find out.
Okay, our next question comes from Jeff Kinkley. Any comments on the female principle as the, quote, ravine?
Okay, yeah, I do have some ideas about that. A lot of people, when they're reading the Dàodé Jīng, want to think about the issue of gender and femininity in the Dàodé Jīng itself. And I do agree that the issue of gender is raised in the Dàodé Jīng, of femininity is raised in the Dàodé Jīng. But I don't think, and this is where I disagree a little bit with other people, I don't think it's actually trumpeting the idea of femininity. What it's doing, and this goes back to this, what I'm talking about, this A not A discourse going on, this idea of dualisms. Most texts during this time period will trumpet, for example, the mountain, the male, and I mean, it goes on and on. There are a lot of assumptions about what is what is important. But the Dàodé Jīng wants to come around and say, hey, wait a minute, people. A is only defined by not A, and the two must be in balance with one another. That's why I don't say it trumpets femininity, but it's using images to actually highlight the not A's that other texts are talking about. So instead of talking about mountains, it's actually also venerating ravines. Instead of just being devoted totally to the male, it's also venerating the female, because the two, if we're going to actually unify with the Tao, the two must actually coexist and embrace one another in this common category. So that's how I think of the Dàodé Jīng talking about femininity, or talking about the ravine, these other kinds of images, everyday images that we have. It's actually pushing back against all the other texts, which are only focused on mountains and on men and so forth.
Thank you. That's interesting. Again, more things for me to look up and study.
By the way, everything I'm saying is just my own opinion, so don't.
But they're great, and I appreciate them, and I think our audience does as well, because the questions are coming in now. Our next question comes from Gretchen. How is the start of a lineage determined? They too had ancestors. What happens to the primary ancestor if sacrifices are no longer made?
Excellent, excellent question, Gretchen. Okay, on the everyday level, the foundation of a lineage, the first ancestor, is usually associated with whoever won the land upon which the subsequent lineage still makes its livelihood. So if you could actually have, say, a second son who doesn't actually inherit the principal plot, he has to go off and actually cultivate some uncultivated land, and he becomes the first ancestor to that branch lineage. And so it's a very practical thing in the sense that the first ancestor is oftentimes not the trunk lineage, but is actually a collateral lineage. However, and here it becomes even more interesting, when we're talking about those emperors who had first received the mandate, the sons of heaven and so forth. All of the imperial lineages will trace its own history back to a supernatural event. And so, for example, the Zhou lineage is very famously, the mother of the Zhou lineage famously stepped on the footprint of a giant and suddenly became pregnant. Now, the point is, I mean, it's a wonderful story and so forth, but it does remove the messiness of the idea of, okay, where did the first ancestor then come from? And if the first ancestor had a father, should we not actually worship that father rather than the first ancestor? These legends, I think, developed in order to avoid exactly that question. One dynasty, the mother actually swallows an egg that came from the heavens. The Han dynasty, the first mother is a dragon flew over her and she became pregnant and so forth. So in all of these stories, you're removing the idea of a father to the first ancestor. So in other words, in sum, you've got two answers. One is the practical level, whoever first gets the land. Second, on the imperial level, you have these stories in which there is actually a supernatural first cause. It also kind of, that second one actually kind of nicely merges with this idea of, you know, the heavens being partnered with that first ancestor, because it was actually the heavens which are responsible for making that first ancestor.
Wow, I need to take a breath. Thank you so much. A follow-up question to that is, with you know, that determination of those first and early ancestors, how is it passed down through the generations? Is it diluted? Can subsequent generations therefore acquire it, I guess, if they, you know, win the land?
Yes, an excellent question. And the answer is a little bit complex. And here I have to go back to the practicals of it. Ideally, the land is passed down from first son to first son to first son to first son. Now, in reality, biology steps in, and after 4 generations, lineages peter out on average, that they don't have a first son. Maybe they only have daughters. And oftentimes you will actually have that land and that lineage then pass to a branch lineage, which is then officially declared the new trunk lineage, and it carries on from there. And as I said a moment ago, those second sons and third sons and fourth sons, they're supposed to go out and actually cultivate their own land and so forth. And they in turn become their own first ancestors and carrying on the lineage with its land. It's all about land all the time. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. One way that the emperors, particularly already in the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BCE, they wanted to lay some controls over these other lineages which are out there because they posed a problem. I mean, they were rival powers, and so we need to figure out a way of knocking them down. Well, that's when the court began enforcing what we call partible inheritance. In other words, all the land cannot go down to just the first son. It has to be distributed among the sons. Maybe the first son will get more than the second son, but the second son will get some, the third son will get some, etc., in lesser and lesser amounts. And that was a way of actually diluting lineages. And you know, we said because we care about the second sons and the third sons, and we're really worried about them, according to the court and the emperors and so forth. But that actually became a way of breaking down the lineages, and it worked. Actually, the kingdoms that dot the Han Dynasty, you know, we get the Qin, which only lasts for 21 years, but then we get the Han, which lasts for 400 years, and so that's kind of the beginning of imperial history. The kingdoms that were there at the beginning all dissipate because they are broke down through this idea of partible inheritance. So it's an excellent question. Sorry, it's a little bit of a complex answer, but it's something that they worried about a lot.
Thank you so much. I do want to note that we have hit kind of our 11 o'clock time, but if it's okay, Ken, we've got some more questions. Would you, all right?
Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. All right, we're gonna try to do a few more of these questions. The next one, let's see, comes from John Wong. Did the concept of yin and yang exist before the Daode Jing?
Good question. Chances are yes, but the yin and the yang do not figure heavily into the Daode Jing. They are there. There is actually, for example, a passage which says, talks about the yin that you wear on your back and the yang that you embrace in front of you. Those two things have to function together. And to me, here I'm always going back to A not A type thinking, every yang is actually defined by its yin, and the two have to actually function in tandem with one another. So it is actually already in the Daode Jing itself. Now, of course, this all depends on how far back we push the date of the Daode Jing. Right now, we think maybe 300 BCE is kind of like when we're starting to get this corpus really circulating. Was yin and yang prior to that? Yeah, we believe it was actually. Although you have to also keep in mind that yin and yang, the original meanings of yin and yang mean the shady side of a hill or of a river versus the light side of a hill or of a river. And it's actually a tool we use in relativity. And so I could go on this at great length and what we mean by that. But it's these two are always in tandem with one another, and you do see that in the Daode Jing itself. Not a lot, admittedly, but it does actually occur there.
Thank you so much for that. Our next question is going into the food, actually. So,
my favorite topic.
Yes. So it says, you taught us how to cook the great stew, parentheses, boil some meat. What is the ale that everyone is drinking as they honor their ancestors? Is this the same word often translated as wine?
Excellent question. And if you ever want to see a good fist fight among China scholars, you actually use the word jiu, which is the Chinese word, and say this means wine, because they will start fighting back and forth what this jiu originally was. Keep in mind, it was not wine in the sense of the modern world. We do not have grapes. That's only later coming into China. Funny thing is, when I originally submitted my article, my chapter to this book, which is coming out in the fall, one of the reviewers had one comment only, and that's because the term jiu, I just translated as alcohol because I wanted to avoid the argument in general. But they said, this is ridiculous. You have to actually translate it as something. So, okay, I'm going to go for ale. Technically, ale is the closest that we know that jiu probably was. It's fermented grain rather than actual grapes. There's a question about whether or not distillation was actually used. It very well may not have actually been used during this time period, but this is a highly, highly debated issue right now. Most people these days actually will call it ale rather than wine, because wine has too many connotations of grapes and so forth. But the problem is, when people start talking about ale, well, we think about IPAs and beer and so forth, and yet that actually has its own baggage. We're talking about ale, but we're talking about something that the elites are drinking rather than something you'll go into your local pub. So yeah, it's a very controversial issue, and I've opted for ale for very, very thoughtful reasons in the process.
Thank you. That's, again, more clarification. I love it. A follow-up for that is also the stew and the dishes. You touched on just the metaphorization, if I pronounced that correctly.
Yep.
Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Well, that was the idea of Gilles Boileau, who is a French scholar, and the only person ever to even mention the fact that the ancestral cult might have some relevance to the Daode Jing at all. But unfortunately, that's the only thing he says. He doesn't say anything else about all the other stuff that I gave you today. And his article is simply about how we should think about the Daode Jing in terms of rituals, that there are other rituals during this time period. But what he is arguing, I think, fits perfectly well with what I'm trying to put forward here, in the sense that the most immediate ancestors are going to get complex dishes, which are very detailed, and you're going to be able to, you know, this is the millet, this is the meat, this is the ale, and they're all going to be prepared in separate, distinct ways. Whereas the most distant ancestor, those details fade, and they become this homogeneous state. Now, why is this important? Keep in mind that when we're talking about sacrifices in early China, this is not like the Greeks, where the Greeks would give the worst food in sacrifices to their ancestors. No, we give the best food. Why? Because after we give the sacrifice of food, we party, we eat the food, it's an excuse to bring the family together, and kind of like, you know, an American Thanksgiving type scenario where the family all comes together and remembers their ancestors. We eat the food. And in fact, it is said in other texts that the ancestors themselves, they only dine on the aroma of the food. So you present to the ancestors to begin with, they dine on the aroma, which makes sense because they are ethereal themselves in nature. So they're going to be dining on the more ethereal element. And then the rest of us, once we carried out the sacrifice, we're actually going to eat that sacrifice ourselves. And in fact, those people who couldn't actually get to the sacrifice, if they've at the very end of the sacrifice, or at the very end of the feast, we're actually going to divide up the rest of the meat very evenly, and each person is going to get an amount of that meat in terms of their relative position to the ancestor that is being worshipped. And so it gets really, really detailed. Again, this speaks to that order that I was talking about earlier, this emphasis of order among the living sacrificers when they're looking back at their ancestors. Sorry, I could talk about food endlessly when it comes to this, but I just love Gilles Boileau's idea that, you know, you've got detailed dishes for the immediate ancestors versus this homogeneity, this one-notedness for the most distant ancestors. That's why the Tao is bland. That's why the Tao is tasteless, because it doesn't have these A demarcations in the flavors.
Oh, just amazing. Thank you. Yes, we've got more questions. Next one is, were chapters of the Daode Jing reactions to Confucius Analects?
Probably not. For one thing, as I said earlier, I don't think it's an argument against the Confucianism at all. In fact, when the Daode Jing is treating Confucianism, don't think of it as in terms of reacting to or responding to. Rather, the Daode Jing is simply saying Confucianism is the silver medal position, whereas this idea of the Tao is the gold medal position. Nothing wrong with a silver medal. I'd love to have a silver medal, but it is a silver medal. Why? Because they are going in for these A not A dualisms. They're beginning to break things actually down. Now, there's another historical reason why the Daode Jing is probably not a reaction to the Analects. Most recent scholarship now says that the Analects is probably a product of the 2nd or 1st century BCE. And that the original Analects, kind of like the way I was describing the Daode Jing a moment ago, is traveling around as a corpus of bits. Same thing is happening to the Analects. And it's not until you get into the 1st and 2nd century BCE that you actually have a text, which is called the Analects. Interesting thing is the Analects is originally not considered a text for adults. It's actually considered a text for children. It's a primer, an educational primer, and it always gets mentioned alongside the Xiaojing, the classic of filial piety, which is also an educational primer in early China. So chances are, no, it's not probably responding to the Analects directly.
Thank you. Our next question is also as a specific one. Why is the number of acceptable generations 5? Is there significance to that?
Yes. Well, when the one of the texts that I cited there that actually says that such is the nature of heaven or something like that, in terms of determining the fiveness, there is actually something to that, and that has to do with how much recall we can remember as people. And it tends to be about, for a very elite family, believe it or not, it does tend to be about 4 generations. I say 5, keep in mind the 5th one is actually the first ancestor. So it's really just 4 immediate ancestors. Now you saw that picture where they actually had 6 tablets in it. That's because that's a special case, because the Zhou dynasty itself, they had a primary ancestor, and then they later had ancestors who founded the Zhou state. And so Kings Wen and Wu actually had their own permanent tablets as well. And that's why they've actually got 6, actually 7, if you include the first ancestor there as well. But it's still only 4 of the immediate ancestors that are actually being remembered. But that number 4, the 4 generations, is probably important because modern studies have showed, and these are not Chinese studies, these are just general sociology studies. Modern studies actually show that when you have non-literate cultures, and keep in mind, in early China, we do have a lot of literature, but it's primarily texts in heads rather than texts on paper or on bamboo strips. When you have oral-based cultures, 4 generations tends to be the average, that they will maximally represent as the now versus the past. Usually they demarcate time much more dramatically than we do, as we think of timelines, 2022 back to 2021 and so forth, on and on. Keep in mind, early China doesn't even have a continuous year count during this time period. Instead, it is present versus past, and especially for the well-positioned lineages, like an imperial lineage would be, that present tends to be 4 generations. They can sort of remember back to that point, but beyond that, physical memory fades. There's pretty much no chance of actually remembering 5 generations back. So yeah, that's so when that text actually says this is the nature of heaven, it's probably saying this is human nature. This is actually it goes along with what humans can actually naturally, biologically remember.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. I think we should be able to get to them. Next one comes from Moshe. Is there a material, for example, financial practice associated with the ancestor culture?
Oh, absolutely. And it has to do with what I was talking mainly before about land. And this is something I do actually write about in one of my books. The ancestral cult is really a land-based cult. It's actually an argument as to who gets to control the land. That first ancestor is the one who won the land from which our livelihood now depends. Those ancestors are in fact buried into the land, and they're actually described as the ancestors physically dispersing inside that land, because they decay and they become the land. And in who controls the lineage is basically who controls the land. So when it comes to actual resources, definitely the whole thing is actually based on a land distribution question.
Thank you. All right, our next question is, can you elaborate your opinions on the authors of the Daode Jing, Lao Tzu, with respect to your theory on the forbearance of ancestral cult?
Yeah, sure. And this, I have to allude to how I answered an earlier question, the fact that there is actually no author per se in this, that this is actually just a corpus of text. On the other hand, I do find it rather interesting, those people who, if you translate Lao Tzu literally, of course, it's the old one, the old master. Now, there's lots of arguments here what's going on as old. Maybe it was a surname back then or whatnot. We don't know. But then again, this may be alluding to age veneration, just like what I was talking about all the way through today, that, you know, this is a veneration of generations and so forth. But as I say, Lao Tzu himself was probably a myth, as far as we best know. His earliest biography that we have only comes to us in the early 1st century BCE by the pen or the brush of Sima Qian. Anything prior to that, it's just guesswork. I'm afraid we really don't know anything about the actual authors themselves. And that's why we tend to treat it as sort of a corpus of ideas. And that idea of it being a corpus is backed up by the fact that we're getting these partial collections of the Daode Jing rather than just one set text. And just to add one interesting note to this, if I gave this talk maybe 40 years ago, I would have to be reliant upon one version of the Daode Jing that we have, and this is what we call the Wangbi version, because Wangbi was a commentator in the 2nd century CE to it, and we'd actually have to say, oh, this is what we've got in the Daode Jing. We now have, because of excavations, I think we have 7, and they all have these little variations in it. Sometimes the earliest ones are partial, and that's why, and they're mixed. And that's why we think about it in terms of corpuses of ideas rather than of an actual author.
Thank you. We are going to wrap up with one more question. And this one is, so you were talking about how the Tao is reaching toward unity and naming is moving toward fracturing or deconstruction. And right. I can't help but thinking about like how it's applicable to the current world and to current events. Do you have any thoughts on, you know, your theory and Tao and all of that, how that relates to current times? Oh boy,
that's a, you saved the hardest question for last, and I'm not going to be able to answer it very well at all. But I do think about this in modern times quite a bit, actually. I mean, I don't claim to be a Taoist or a Buddhist or a Confucian or anything. I do tend to step back from these things myself. But when I do think about, is the Tao still relevant to today? And one way it is relevant, and I think, and I do actually believe this quite firmly, is that we do tend to focus only on the A, and we forget that the not A is actually defining that A all the time. Think of everyone in their own individual lives, that they are just focused on one particular thing, one particular, I don't know, you know, is it a monetary reward? Is it politics, you know, a political party, a political idea, or something like that? We always tend to focus just on that A, and we fail to totally nuance why that A is that A. And because we're always forgetting about what generates the not A and how these things come to negotiate with one another. So if you're asking me about modern politics or something like that, I would say, yeah, the Daode Jing does have a lesson for us for today. I can only be really abstract about it right now, and if not Lao Tzu, we're not even talking about my favorite Taoist, who is Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi has even much more to say in which that can be applied to our modern existences, but that's another talk for another day.
I imagine it could be an entirely its own presentation as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for this great presentation and your answers afterwards have just been fabulous. We have some comments coming in from our audience. Thank you for a very interesting discussion, a wonderful and memorable talk. Someone says, thank you so much for exposing me to another facet of Chinese history and knowledge. And we've had a couple entreaties to let us know when your theory and your book are published, because we definitely want to see that. So again, we're at the end of our Q&A session. For Ken, I did want to offer if you had any last thoughts or anything else you'd like to add.
I have no thoughts. I wish you all a happy balancing of your A and your not A.
Thank you so much. Again, it's been great. It's lovely to have you back as always, and especially to close out what's been a great season of programming. And so I just want to remind everyone that if you plan on coming to our tea house, please, log out of this webinar when we're done and then click on the second link that's in your confirmation emails. And yeah, again, thank you all for supporting us and coming to our programs this past season. To all of our great speakers this past year, thank you so much for giving us your time and your knowledge and all of your whole selves. And so, yeah, as you see on that slide, if you have any questions or comments about the season, or if you have any questions during the summer break, feel free to send us an email or visit our website. Our email is firstsaturdaypdx@gmail.com, and our website is www.firstsaturdaypdx.org. And yeah, again, thank you so much, everybody. And if you're coming to the tea house, we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you. Have a good weekend.